Hi everyone, it's Gemma Ware here, host of The Conversation Weekly. We're starting the show this week with a request for your help. Democracy is in crisis around the world. Trust in politicians and key institutions is in decline, populism is on the rise, and misinformation, disinformation, and a cycle of outrage are fueling the fire. Here at The Conversation, we have a unique solution. We team academics up with journalists to deliver research-based news and analysis. Our stories are accurate, unbiased, and crucially free. We make our work available at no cost because we believe that for democracy to thrive, people need trustworthy information. We collaborate across 9 editions worldwide to bring you the best information and the latest groundbreaking research on global issues. And we know that what we're doing is making a long-term difference because we measure the impact. If you want to join us on our mission, then consider becoming a donor. Your gift can help support a healthier democracy. To donate, please go to donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. And you can follow the link for that directly from our show notes. Thanks very much for your help. Now on with this week's episode.
A mother orca whose calf died after birth is still carrying her baby 17 days later.
The orca taliqua was seen carrying her baby's corpse for 17 days and over 1,000 miles.
This is Susana Monzo. She's a philosopher who asks questions about how animals perceive the world. She's telling me about a remarkable case of an orca called Taliqua, who made the headlines in summer 2018. She was seen swimming along the coast of North America near Washington and British Columbia, pulling along the corpse of her baby calf.
We have to remember that orcas don't have hands, that they're in a liquid medium, that they have to constantly resurface to breathe. And she's balancing this baby that weighs hundreds of kilos on her snout to prevent it from, being carried off by the current or sinking or whatever. And it just shows such a degree of motivation behind this behavior.
Death touches every living being, but what if other animals understand it in ways we humans never imagined? In this week's episode, we're speaking to Susana Monzo, who's an associate professor in philosophy at the National Distance Education University in Madrid, Spain, about the profound and often overlooked question of how animals understand death. Her findings challenge us to rethink what we know about the inner lives of animals, and perhaps even to reevaluate our own relationship with death. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. Susana didn't grow up particularly interested in animals.
In fact, I remember being quite annoyed whenever my friends would stop in the street to pet a dog. I didn't really see what was so special about that.
But then when she was 16, she adopted a dog.
And my dog and I became really, really close. He was, he remains the love of my life. And I was the person he was most bonded to in my family. We lived together for 16 years. He passed away in March of 2020, sadly. But he was really the one who initiated all this interest in animal minds for me. He was a wire-haired dachshund. If you've ever met a dog of this breed, they're extremely stubborn. It's very, very clear if you hang out with one of these dogs for a while that they have an inner life, that they have their own beliefs and desires and wants and needs and a very strong personality. And so he was the one who just sparked my interest in these issues.
And what was his name?
Tote.
Tote, okay. Susana did her PhD on animal morality.
So the question of whether animals can behave morally, whether they can behave on the basis of motivations like empathy and compassion.
She started thinking about other research questions to focus on and hit upon mortality.
I was about to turn 30 at the time, and as often happens for people around that age, I became obsessed with death, with my own death in particular. I was suddenly very worried about the idea that I would die someday. And the two things seemed completely unrelated at the time for me. I didn't make that connection. But now that it's been several years and looking back, it seems very obvious now that I turned towards that topic also because unconsciously I needed answers myself.
In 2021, Susanna published her research in a book called Playing Possum: How Animals Understand Death, and it's recently been translated into English for the first time. When you think about animals' relationship to death, what are you referring to specifically?
So this question divides up into two different ones, which is, how do animals understand death? Can they grasp the concept of death? Can they understand that they will die? Can they understand what has happened when another individual has died? And then there's like the emotional side of the question, which is whether animals can grieve and whether they can experience other death-related emotions and what kind of behaviors these emotions give rise to.
We obviously can't ask animals either of those questions. We can't ask them about their feelings, their thoughts, and obviously this is something that you must have thought about a lot in this line of research. So tell me, how do you go about studying this and trying to understand what an animal thinks or feels about death?
So I am a philosopher and my methodology is philosophical. So this means that I don't actually carry out empirical research myself, but I'm also not what's called an armchair philosopher. So I'm not just like thinking about these issues in a vacuum, but rather I read a lot of science and this science informs my thinking. I start from the world and then I build my theory from the bottom up.
Susanna spent countless hours meticulously poring over scientific research. She looked for studies where people had observed animals' reactions to the death of a fellow animal. This included observational studies in the wild as well as lab experiments. She told me that one of the most striking examples she came across involved a group of chimpanzees reacting to a newborn that was albino.
So chimpanzee mothers, when they give birth, they often go away from the group to protect the baby from infanticide. And so the mother was apparently caught on her return to the group, and the researchers could witness the reaction of the group members to the baby's unusual appearance. And the chimpanzees went really crazy. So this albinism is an extremely rare condition in chimpanzees, and they reacted in a way that suggested very strongly that they were very fearful of this baby. So they were alarm calling, they were very excited, there was a lot of panic.
What followed was both unexpected and revealing.
The alpha male grabbed the baby, and between him and a couple other males, they killed him. And the behavior of the group members in that moment radically changed. And they all gave in to a sense of curiosity. They all surrounded the corpse and started smelling it, touching it, pulling on its hair, comparing it to their own. And this, for me, is a really good piece of evidence of chimpanzees understanding death, because understanding death means understanding irreversible non-functionality.
By irreversible non-functionality, Susanna means that this chimpanzee baby no longer performed the actions or behaviours associated with being alive, like breathing, moving, or interacting, and that this condition was permanent and irreversible.
And this shows us, or at least strongly suggests, that the chimpanzees understood that whatever it was that the baby could have done to them while he was alive was no longer a threat, because the baby was dead now.
Another remarkable case she studied was that of an opossum.
So the opossum is the protagonist of my book and has become one of my favorite animals because of this research. And the opossum, apart from being extremely cool and extremely cute, does this pretty amazing thing when she feels threatened and when she feels she doesn't have a chance to escape, which is that she plays dead. But she does this in a very spectacular way. So she doesn't just stay still. Rather, she adopts the bodily and facial expression of a corpse. Her bodily functions are reduced, so her breathing and heart rate drop. Her body temperature drops. She opens her mouth and her tongue hangs out and adopts this bluish hue. And she expels this putrid smelling liquid from her anal glands. And she stops responding to the world. Like even if you pick her up or cut her tail, which some scientists in the 60s unfortunately did, she would not react. And if you didn't know ahead of time of her little trick, you would for sure be tricked by it.
But why does the opossum do this? And what can this extraordinary behaviour teach us about the concept of death in animals more generally?
Now, the opossum is a very important piece for the puzzle that I build in my book, where I try to argue that the concept of death is very widespread in the animal kingdom. And this is not because the opossum herself understands that she's playing dead. For the opossum, this behavior is likely automatic in the same way as when we are in a state of fear, our pupils dilate or our hair stands on end. It's something that we can't help doing and we can't really control, and we don't really understand the function behind it.
Instead, Susanna believes the real insight comes from understanding the predators the opossum is trying to deceive.
If the opossum's death display exists, and if it exists at that level of complexity, we have to give an evolutionary explanation for how it emerged throughout evolutionary history. Because there is no connection between all of these components, between having this facial and bodily expression, these bodily functions being reduced, the foul smell, the blue tongue. There's no connection between these except for the fact that they're all signs of being dead. This points us to the selection pressure, which will have given shape to this display throughout evolutionary history. And this selection pressure is the concept of death of the deceived predators. So when the opossum's playing dead, she's trying to, I say trying, but in scare quotes, obviously.
Yeah.
That's right. She's trying to convince the predator that she's dead because this will give her a chance to escape. But for this to work, the predator needs to take her for dead. The opossum shows us how her predators think of death, what they think a corpse looks like and smells like and feels like. And that's why she succeeds in deceiving them. And it makes it more likely for her to pass on her genes.
Susanna told me that the examples of the chimpanzees and of the opossum are significant because they demonstrate how the conception of death can be vital to a species' survival and its evolutionary success. But there are also cases that could reveal something deeper, insights into animals' inner worlds and how they emotionally relate to death. So that's about the unconscious, in some ways, understanding of death and its power to deceive. But then there are also some examples taking the other side of grief, I think.
So perhaps the most noteworthy behavior that scientists have documented and that's related to grief is what's called deceased infant carrying. So this is a behavior that a lot of mammalian mothers engage in and consists of hanging on to their baby's corpse for extended periods of time. There was, for instance, a case recently in a zoo in Valencia.
For the past 3 months, visitors to the Biopark Zoo in Valencia, Spain, have witnessed a poignant scene. A grieving chimpanzee named Natalia carrying her deceased baby. The infant died when it was only a few days old, and Natalia has since clung to the lifeless body, seemingly unable to let go.
A chimpanzee was holding on to her baby's corpse for 7 months, which is a ridiculous amount of time. Like, I don't even know how the corpse lasted that long.
And then, of course, there was the orca mother Taliqua, who carried the corpse of her baby for 1,000 miles. At first glance, this kind of behaviour might seem counterproductive. Why would an animal devote so much energy to something that seemingly offers no evolutionary advantage?
It seems like very maladaptive in a lot of respects. Like, why are these mothers spending so much energy on these babies who are dead? They're not contributing to passing on their genes. What's going on? And so There are like a bunch of different factors that might be coming into play here, but it seems that one of the biggest factors has to do with maternal grief, with the bond between the mother and her baby. So these are animals that have extended periods of maternal care and a high level of dependency on the part of the baby. And so evolution needs to have provided the mothers with very strong motivations to take care of the babies, because otherwise the babies are not going to make it to maturity. And these mechanisms are so strong that they don't just instantaneously disappear once the baby dies. It takes a while for them to fade away. And for the mother, this is going to manifest likely in a way where she has the motivation to continue caring for this corpse.
Is it usually the mother?
There are some examples of the father, and there are examples as well of other group members doing this, like a sibling or even unrelated members in some cases. But the vast majority of cases, it's the mother.
And is it always to do with a baby, or does it extend other examples of grief beyond just an infant?
So there are also suggestive examples of grief towards other individuals. For instance, there's a case that I also find super heartbreaking of a little gorilla called Segasira who lost his mother. And he was seen interacting with the corpse in a prolonged kind of way, and he was grooming it and holding it, laying next to it. And at some point, he also attempted to suckle from her breast, even though he had been weaned some time ago. The researchers speculated that maybe he was looking for some kind of comfort for his own anguish.
While such behaviours may seem like grief, there's an ongoing debate between scientists and philosophers about what's really going on. Is this truly grief as we humans understand it, or are we projecting our emotions onto these animals? Where do you fall on that debate then? Is it an emotional response to death, or is it purely instinctive in some ways?
So I don't think that that's a real dichotomy. I don't think that these are instinctive responses when we're talking about animals as cognitively complex as chimpanzees. There's definitely a lot of cognition involved, but that's a different question from whether what they're doing is grieving. A lot of what the researchers have been doing is trying to find evidence of grief in animals. And I think that on the one hand, I think it's a very important endeavor, and we should absolutely be asking whether animals can grieve. And I do think there's a lot of very suggestive evidence in this regard. But I think that if we only focus on grief, we're going to be missing a really big part of the full picture, because grief is just one possible emotional reaction to death. There are many other ways of emotionally reacting to the fact that someone has died. You know, if you find out that someone has died, you might feel joy if it means you're inheriting a bunch of money, or you might feel anger if the deceased owed you money and now you're never going to get it back, or you might feel hunger or excitement if you're maybe stuck in the Andes and there's no food around and someone has just died, and maybe you're getting to have some dinner tonight. So there are all these emotional reactions, and they're all perfectly compatible with your capacity to understand that this individual has indeed died. So what grief signals is the presence of a strong social bond between the deceased and the griever. But this needn't be the case. Sometimes witnessing a death might mean that you get to eat tonight. And, that might be a large part of animals' experience with death.
I guess there's a tendency to try and compare it, isn't there? And as you say, there's a real difference between a chimpanzee than there might be to, say, an insect in some way, or in terms of the level of A, proximity to humans, and B, kind of development of their social bonds, etc. But how do you think an animal's understanding of death differs from a human understanding of death?
I don't think that we can give a straightforward answer to that question, because on the one hand, there's no such thing as the human understanding of death, because humans vary a lot in how they understand death developmentally, and also like the different meanings that we attribute to death, and like what we think happens after death and so on. There's a lot of variability among humans. And there's also going to be a huge variability among animals, because the animal kingdom is really very diverse and large, and like there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer to that question. I also think that animals are not born with a concept of death, but rather this is something that develops as a result of their own experiences. So the kind of concept of death that they have is going to depend on their lived experiences, their own life history.
No matter the animal or the situation being studied, Susanna says researchers must be cautious about projecting human concepts or ways of thinking onto another animal, a tendency that's known as anthropomorphism. This is especially critical when scientists are out in the field observing animals in their natural habitats.
When we're in the wild and we're just like observing something that we happen to come across, we don't have these controls. And so there is the worry that it might make it more likely that we're just going to project our own human experiences to make sense of what we're seeing. And I think this is a legitimate worry. And we do definitely have to be careful not to fall prey of anthropomorphism. However, there is a bias that is its contrary, that has received way less attention in these debates, which would be like the other side of the coin. So anthropomorphism is the mistaken attribution of a human-like quality to an animal. Anthropectomy is the mistaken denial of a human-like quality to an animal. So if we say of the orca Taliqua that she's grieving when she's not, we would be anthropomorphizing Taliqua. But if we say that she's not grieving because she's an orca and only humans grieve when she's actually grieving, then we would be anthropectomizing Taliqua. These are both errors. They're both mistaken descriptions of reality. And so they would both constitute a failed scientific endeavor if this is our conclusion, if we're arriving at a false description of the world. And so we need to be wary of both. We need to be careful not to over-attribute, but also not to under-attribute.
Despite these challenges, Susanna believes there are still broader insights we can draw from the scientific observations of animals and death.
I distinguish what I call the minimal concept of death, which is made up of this idea of non-functionality and irreversibility, the idea that dead individuals don't do things and that this is an irreversible state. So that's the theoretical construct that we can use to determine when an animal has begun to understand death. But I think that in nature, the concept of death is likely to emerge with a little more complexity, with some understanding of the fact that death can also happen to individuals who are now alive. There is like a very widespread presence of learning whereby animals can make these generalizations from their past experiences to future ones. But this only gives us like some vague ideas of how they're going to understand death. And I think it's going to vary a lot between species and also between different individuals.
Is it linked to intelligence in some way then?
It's linked to intelligence, but it's also linked to an animal's experiences. You need a certain level of cognition to be able to reach these concepts. So it's going to depend on that cognition, on the experiences of the individual, and also the emotions that an individual feels. And like certain emotions can be really helpful here. Like for instance, being very bonded to someone can help you in paying attention to their corpse once they die, not wanting to leave its side. And so this gives you an opportunity to learn about it. But very different emotions can also work here, like the excitement of the hunt and the hunger and wanting your prey to stop thrashing so you can dig in.
What can we as humans learn about our own relationship to death from the rest of the animal kingdom?
I think there's a lot to learn already through this philosophical inquiry into what it means to understand death. If you're sufficiently reflective when you are studying animals and trying to find a capacity, you're also going to be reflecting on how that capacity manifests in humans. That's going to happen naturally. I also think that there's a lot to learn in that animals are just, first of all, they're amazing and they are like just mind-blowing in their diversity. And I think there's a lot of like humility for us to learn there in just observing animals and observing how they go through their lives and how they deal with this phenomenon. But there's also perhaps some calm for us to find in our own existential fears by looking at animals, because when you stop to study animals' relationship to death, one thing that becomes immediately clear is how all animals have to deal with this.
Yeah.
You know? And so sometimes you need to like get out of your own head and see that death is not something unfair that happens to just us. It's not like we've been dealt an unfair hand. It's like a deal that every single animal that's alive has to step into. If you want to be alive, then you have to die. And all animals are in these bodies that eventually irreparably break. And I find something very comforting there in thinking that we're all in this together, so to speak.
Thank you so much, Susanna, for coming on and raising these questions and thoughts for us. We really appreciate you sharing your research. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this week's episode. It was written and produced by Mend Marawani with production assistance from Katie Flood. Sound design was by Michelle Macklem and our theme music is by Nita Saal. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor and I'm Gemma Ware, the executive producer. You can connect with us on Instagram at theconversation.com or email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. As we said at the top of this episode, The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com. And please do also rate and review the show wherever you follow us. It really does help. Thanks very much for listening.